everyone online to this École des Modernités lecture. I am happy to welcome tonight Asato Ikeda, who's next to me. Thank you, Asato, for coming to Paris. Asato Ikeda is an associate professor at Fordham University and currently visiting professor at Novo Nordisk in Copenhagen. Her work focuses on modern and contemporary Japanese art, and more specifically before, during, and after the Second World War. Among other publications, I would like to mention the Art and War in Japan and its Empire, 1931-1961 book that she co-edited in 2012. She's also the co-author of A Third Gender, Beautiful Youth in Japanese Edo Period Prints and Paintings, published in 2016. And most recently, The Politics of Painting, Fascism and Japanese Art During the Second World War, that was published in 2018. It's also close to tonight's subject that Asato Ikeda chose to entitle From Parisian Modernism to Japanese Fascism, Ihara Usaburō, Koiso Ryōhei, and Miyamoto Saburō. We'll see that indeed, as I think you will recall us, not only Fujita Tsuguharu came to Paris and then came back to Japan for, in his case, coming back to France afterwards. But some others, among which Ihara Usaburō, Koiso Ryōhei, and Miyamoto Saburō, contributed to the definition of modernity in Paris before joining the war effort in Japan, and contributing to the propaganda that itinerary raises, of course, many concerns that I hope we'll be able to discuss tonight. Thank you again for your lecture. Thank you, Asato Ikeda, for accepting this lecture, and we're all yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for the general introduction, and also inviting me and facilitating the event by making the arrangement for the trip and so on. And it's my honor to be able to give a talk at the Giacometti Institute. I also like to thank you for attending this talk this evening and using your precious time coming out in this strange weather. It's supposed to be spring, but a little cold. Just a disclaimer, I don't speak French, but I'll be pronouncing or mispronouncing some French words or using some crappy English translations, so bear with me. I'm a specialist of Japanese art during the Second World War, and I have previously written about Fujita Tsuguharu, arguably the most famous Japanese artist in France. He established himself in the 1920s as a modernist artist in Paris, later became a propaganda war artist for the Japanese state, but returned to Paris and died as a French citizen in the 1960s. His works are housed at a number of museums in Paris, such as Pompidou Center and the Museum of Modern Art of the City of Paris. For this particular talk, I was specifically asked to discuss other Japanese artists, not Fujita. So what I will do is that I will introduce 3 artists who, like Fujita, spent time in Paris and later became war propaganda painters. Ihara Usaburō, Koiso Ryōhei, and Miyamoto Saburō. Fujita was somewhat of an anomaly because of the unprecedented success he managed to achieve in France, but his professional trajectory, being an elite Japanese artist, studying in Paris, and later working for the Japanese state during the war, was not necessarily unique. And since I will be talking about the art during the Second World War, I'll be touching on some difficult histories, just so that, you know, a little bit of a warning. And I'll be talking for about 60 minutes, and that's quite a long time. So this is the game plan. And I will talk about first westernization and modernization of the country from the mid-19th century onward, very briefly. And I will then introduce biographies and works by Ihara Usaburō, Koiso Ryōhei, and Miyamoto Saburō and their stays in Paris. And then I will shift my focus to the Second World War, and in Japan's context, started in 1930. And then I will carefully discuss paintings by these three artists of the Second World War. And I will conclude my presentation by discussing what happened after the war. So first, let me briefly explain the historical and art historical context. After 250 years of relative isolation, Japan opened its door to the world in the mid-19th century, which was followed by a period of radical modernization and westernization. The artistic system, Western artistic system, and aesthetics were introduced comprehensively. In 1872, the government established the first national art museum, the Tokyo National Museum. That was followed by the founding of the first national art school, the Tokyo National School of Fine Arts, in 1887. In 1907, a state-sponsored annual exhibition, the Ministry of Education Art Exhibition, was established that was modeled after French salons. The national art taught two main types of painting. One, Japanese-style painting, which used mineral-based ink on paper or silk, which we see on the right side by Hishida Shunso. And the other type was Western-style painting, which was basically oil painting. Both Japanese and Western-style painters largely operated within the framework of state institutions, trying to create art that reflects Japan's emerging national identity. The first head of the Western-style painting at the school was Kuroda Seiki, who studied in Paris between 1884 and 1891. He was trained by Raphael Collin, who mostly worked in an academic style, but with some impressionistic qualities. The three artists that I will discuss today were all Western-style painters, and Ihara Usaburō and Koiso Ryōhei both studied at the Tokyo School of Fine Arts. So now I will move on to talk about three artists in detail. So Ihara Usaburō was a Western-style oil painter who is today credited for introducing and popularizing Picasso's work in Japan in the 1920s and 30s. Ihara was born in 1894 in Osaka, Western Japan, and he entered the Tokyo School of Fine Arts. At the school, Ihara was trained by Fujishima Takeji, who also lived in Paris between 1905 and 1910. Ihara graduated from the school as the top student in the program and then moved to Paris in 1925 and stayed there for 4 years. In his writing in 1955, Ihara writes that there were more than 400 Japanese painters in Paris at the time. In Paris, he frequently visited the Louvre and copied works of European masters. He was particularly interested in 18th century neoclassicist painting, Jean-Auguste Dominique Anger's Grand Odalisque. Ihara writes that he visited the Louvre probably around 300 times, and his friends made fun of him, calling him a Louvre craze. He explains that he was interested in European neoclassicism because there was no equivalent to it in Japan. He ultimately became obsessed with Picasso's paintings, but not his cubist paintings, such as the Ladies of Avignon, where he presented disjoined, fragmented female bodies. But Ihara was interested in Picasso's so-called new classical paintings from the 1920s. Picasso's new classicism, as exemplified by three women at the spring on the right, is characterized by his move away from radical abstraction after his trip to Italy in 1917 and his turn to figurative, classicizing works, which was inspired by works of Italian Renaissance. They were nevertheless not as naturalistic as his pre-Cubist works from very early years. The classicizing tendency of modernist art in the 20s and 30s is often referred to as New Classicism rather than Neoclassicism to make the distinction between similarly classicizing movement in the 18th century and early 20th century. New Classicism was not unique to Picasso. Scholars have identified the same return to order, so to speak, aspect of works in the same period in France, Italy, and Germany by such artists as Giorgio de Chirico and Mario Cironi in Italy. The exhibition Chaos and Classicism, held by Guggenheim Museum in New York in 2010, is probably the best and most comprehensive study of this topic to my knowledge, at least in English-speaking scholarship. There have been a scholarly debate about the extent to which the early 20th century New Classicism might have affected Japanese art, both oil paintings and traditional Japanese style painting. Yamatane Museum in Japan organized a symposium called Was There New Classicism in Japan? In 1999, where a number of scholars discussed the topic from different perspectives, and some of them discussed Ihara Usaburō and New Classicism. Ihara's group in a room, Shitsunai Gunzo, from 1928 and 29, now at the Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo, is clearly informed by Picasso's Three Women at the Spring from 1921, now at MoMA in New York. In Ihara's work, three women gather together to look at what seems to be a newspaper. Two of them are sitting on a chair, both of them exposing their breasts. The other woman stands in between them, leaning in to be part of the activity. In Picasso's work, the women sit outside in a rocky background, and they do not engage with each other. Their bodies are defined with visible black outlines, looking angular and blocky. Ihara uses chiaroscuro, rendering the woman's body look softer and more naturalistic. The title of Ihara's painting focuses on the women's communal nature, while Picasso's title focuses on the season, the spring. Ihara writes that the 18th century European works and Picasso's new classicist works made him interested in group portrait. Ihara might not have established his name as remarkably as Fujita did, but he did make some achievement. Some of his works, not this work, were evidently selected by Salon d'Automne in 1927 and 28. The second painter I'd like to introduce now is Koiso Ryōhei. He was born in Kobe, Western Japan, in 1903. Like Ihara, he studied at the Tokyo National School of Fine Arts and graduated as the top of the program. He moved to France in 1928 and studied there for 2 years. Koiso did not leave a substantial record about his stay in Paris, but he was very much connected with Ihara, the first artist that I introduced. Koiso indeed took over Ihara's studio, which was located in the 14th arrondissement of Paris, which we're in today. Like Ihara, Koiso frequently visited the Louvre. One of his favorite paintings was evidently The Wedding of Cana by Paolo Veronese, produced in the mid-16th century. The work, which depicts a biblical story of the moment in which Jesus miraculously converts water into red wine, is known as a representative piece of High Renaissance, with its emphasis on ideal proportions of human figures and balanced composition. Koiso also saw at the Louvre Eugène Delacroix's The Massacre at Chios from 1824, which shows the massacre of Greeks by the Ottoman troops during the Greek War of Independence in 1822. And I will return to this painting in comparison with Koiso's war propaganda painting later on. Woman with a Shawl from 1929 is a rare existent painting from his time in Paris. The painting shows a seated woman draped in somber red and yellowish garment in a private setting. She gazes at the viewer, placing her hands on her lap. The dark tonality of the colors and the woman's gloomy facial expression make the painting look melancholic. The painting is quite different from monumental painting of historic themes like the wedding at Cana or the massacre at Chios, which show a group of human actors in a grand composition that Koiso allegedly find impressive. Rather than focusing on ideal proportions of body or stable composition, here Koiso draws on a style that is characteristically modernist, attention to the inner feeling and subjectivity of the sitter and the artist, and the use of thick black outline to describe the contour of the forms that defies naturalism associated with high Renaissance. The gloomy quality of the portrait make it comparable to works by Soutine and Modigliani in particular. Okay, this is the third artist, and the final artist that I would like to introduce in this presentation is Miyamoto Saburō, who was born in Ishikawa Prefecture in 1905. Unlike Ihara and Koiso, he did not attend the National School of Art, but he attended private art school called Kawabata School, where he was taught by Fujishima Takeji, who was also the teacher of Ihara Usaburō, the first artist that I mentioned. Miyamoto moved to Paris much later than Ihara and Koiso. He left Japan for France in 1938 and had to return to Japan with the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe in 1939. Like Ihara and Koiso, Miyamoto would have frequented to the Louvre, and he would have seen European masterpieces like Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People from 1830, which I will come back to again in my discussion of his wartime painting. Before he started producing war propaganda works, Miyamoto produced numerous portraits of women rendered in post-impressionist manner. Not unlike Koiso's Women with a Shawl, Miyamoto's red background from 1938, which he painted before or during his stay in Paris, is an intimate portrait of a woman. The woman, who could be Japanese, reclines on a sofa, and the wall is painted with reddish purple color with a swirling motif that is echoed by the forms of the woman's body and the sofa. There is a small table stand on which what looks like a round fish tank is placed. The relationship between the foreground and the background is ambivalent, as the decorative motif of the wall makes the space look flat, and the painting does not present a coherent perspective. The artist uses broad, visible brushstrokes that are characteristics of post-impressionism. So just to recap what I've discussed so far before moving on to talk about the Second World War, whether Ihara, Koiso, or Miyamoto, the Louvre, the museum that houses canonical artworks of Western art, was the most important place to be. Those pre-modern academic masterpieces that they saw in Paris, as well as we will see shortly, would significantly inform their wartime art. On the other hand, in a rather contradictory manner, they closely follow the trend of Parisian Modernism in 1920s and 30s, which in principle tried to break away from naturalism that had been fundamental to European academicism. It is important to remember that apart from artists like Ihara, Koiso, and Miyamoto, there were younger generations of more radical leftist artists who tried to change the status quo and challenged the established political and social norms, working in a more experimental forms in Japan. For example, Kambara Tai, a poet and visual artist, created an entirely abstract painting inspired by futurism. One of the most significant art groups in the pre-war period was MAVO, founded in 1923 by Murayama Tomoyoshi, who chose to study in Berlin, Germany, not in Paris. The younger generation of artists rebelled against the hierarchical nature of the national school and its exhibition system established during the earlier period. Inspired by German Dada and Russian constructivism, MAVO produced three-dimensional installation art and performances that incorporated avant-garde dance, often shocking viewers with explicit sexualization of bodies and deliberate gender bending. Some of these artists later became deeply involved in the proletarian art movement. Ihara, Koiso, and Miyamoto, on the other hand, were never involved in leftist politics. Rather, they were elite artists who occupied high positions in a highly hierarchical Japanese art world. While they might have tried to create space alternatives to state institutions, they never questioned the dominant state ideology in the way leftist artists did. Okay, so now I'd like to move on to talk about the Second World War and explain the larger political discourse in modern Japan, which is very important in our discussion of art by Ihara and Koiso and Miyamoto in the late 1930s and early 1940s. So, as I discussed, Japan opened its country to the world in the mid-19th century, and they quickly modernized and westernized itself. Importantly, it also became an imperialist nation with active settler colonial agenda. They acquired Hokkaido in 1869, Okinawa in 1879, Taiwan in 1905, and colonized Korea in 1910. By the 1930s, Japan secured its quote-unquote special interest in Manchuria, which is located in northeastern China. Japan obtained the rights to build a railway there, which was protected by its own military forces. The Japanese context of the Second World War started earlier than in Europe. Scholars often pinpoint the war's start to 1931, when Japan invaded Manchuria, or to 1937, when the nation engaged in undeclared but full-scale warfare with China, which is known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. In the late 1930s, Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro proposed the establishment of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, where Japan and other Asian nations would coexist harmoniously, free from Western imperialism. The image on the right shows the idealized vision of Japan's co-prosperity sphere, which they conceived as a racially diverse community. In reality, however, Japanese troops committed acts of arson, mass rape, and murder against local civilians. They subjected women to sexual slavery and carried out biological experiments on captured Chinese individuals. Initially, Western democratic countries such as Britain and the United States turned a blind eye to Japan's aggression, but by the late 1930s, Japan's territorial expansion in Asia posed a threat to their own economic interest, and residents mainly missionaries and businessmen in the area. In 1941, the United States imposed an embargo on oil and gasoline exports to Japan. In response, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, declared war on the United States and other Western allied nations, a conflict referred to as the Pacific War. Meanwhile, Japan maintained an alliance with certain Western powers, including Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. So I will not go into details about the theoretical discussion about whether we should call Japan fascism or not, although I have written a book about this, just because it's a very big question to answer. However, I would note that numerous scholars and cultural studies specialists have argued that the way in which wartime Japan went against individualism, liberalism, democracy, and imposed state surveillance and censorship, and tried to restore authentic Japanese culture, makes Japan comparable to Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. So now that we kind of cover the historical context of the Second World War and its politics, I will move on to talk about the artistic production. So once the war began, the artistic freedom seen in the 19-teens and 20s evaporated. The scope and the content of artistic activity and production were significantly constrained due to increased national security measures and heightened state control domestically. The prominent proletarian writer Kobayashi Takeshi was arrested and fatally tortured, an event depicted in Tsuda Seifu's painting here called Victim. Tsuda himself was subsequently arrested due to this painting. Murayama Tomoyoshi, the leader of Mabo artists that I mentioned earlier, was also imprisoned twice, first in 1930 and then again in 1932. Then what kind of art did the Japanese state and artists think was appropriate at the time of military conflicts? The round table titled, "Where Will French Art Go?" and National Defense and Art, What Should Artists Do?, both published in the art magazine called Mizie in August 1940 and January 1941, give us some clues. The general consensus reached through this conversation was that Japanese art should stop imitating French art. In 1941 roundtable, 2 military officials and one art critic proclaimed that Japanese had become a colony of France. For them, Japanese art had been bought out by capitalism, commercialism, liberalism, and democracy. And one of the military officials said that even patients at a mental hospital could produce, quote unquote, ridiculous paintings that consisted merely of circles and triangles. The critique of French art was also shared by artists, including, importantly, Miyamoto Saburō, one of the 3 artists that I discussed, and who had just returned from Paris. In the roundtable, Miyamoto stated, "The weakness of French art is the lack of expressions particular to the artist's race." He argued that since successful artists in Paris, such as Picasso and Chagall, were not French, French art was actually the product of foreigners. French art, in short, had failed to establish the art of the French race. It is important to point out here that when they said French art, they meant modern French art that leans toward abstraction, the kind that was created in École de Paris rather than French academic art. All of these critics and artists argued that Japanese art, produced at the time when the country was entering its most glorious period, should express its own racial identity and appeal to a larger audience. Importantly, their discussion was based on their knowledge of European fascist nations, namely Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, and those states comprehensive control of artistic production. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, Nazi German art in particular was increasingly introduced to the Japanese public through art magazines. For example, art critic Uemura Takachiho translated a book by a French author, Eugene Warnard, about Nazi art in the magazine Atelier in October 1937. Just as an interesting side note, Ihara, the first artist that I introduced, and who was previously an ardent follower of Picasso, he recognized the affinity between Picasso's new classicism and German Nazi art in their expressions of law and order. In 1942, he stated that Picasso's art was very much Germanic and wondered why Picasso was anti-Franco and turned his back on the Axis nations. By the early 1940s, the majority of leading artists were brought together under patriotic organizations, and their activities came under national control. It was generally difficult to obtain art supplies, especially after the US embargo, and those artists who worked for the state were given privileged access. Censorship was very tight. Every publication and every artwork came under state scrutiny. Beginning in 1938, many Western-style painters were escorted abroad to produce war campaign record painting, that is called Senso Sakusen Kirokuga, which were meant to capture specific battles and military events. More than 300 Western-style painters were chosen by the military or volunteered to produce such paintings to make visual records of their historic activities. Fujita Tsuguharu, Ihara Usaburō, Koiso Ryōhei, and Miyamoto Saburō all participated in this state-sanctioned project. They traveled to various cities in Asia, sometimes seeing actual battle sites, but often using photographs, when they could not visit actual locations. The paintings were exhibited at state-sanctioned exhibitions and sponsored by major mass media, which were variously titled as war art exhibitions, holy war art exhibitions, or army art exhibitions. They were held at department stores and museums, defined as having, quote, the significant historical purpose of recording and preserving the military's war campaign forever, end quote. War campaign record paintings portrayed Japanese soldiers fighting on the ground, at sea, and in the air, traveling through the Asian continent, interacting with local people, mostly women and children, in areas under Japan's military occupation and commemorating major political events. So now I will start talking about examples by Koiso and Ihara and Miyamoto. So I will start by Koiso's example. Koiso Ryōhei traveled with the Japanese troops to China in 1938 during the Second Sino-Japanese War, when some cities were under Japan's military occupation. He completed battle at the Gate of China in Nanjing upon his return, which was then submitted to the first Holy War Art exhibition in 1939. The painting presents a scene from Japan's capture of Nanjing or Nankin, later revealed to be a site of atrocious massacre of Chinese civilian population. While Koiso visited Nanjing, it was a year after the battle already took place, so his portrayal would have been based on his observation of the city in the aftermath and interviewing the soldiers. Not a straightforward painting. It requires the viewer to spend some time to figure out exactly what's happening in the scene. In the painting, 3 soldiers are placed closest to the picture plane in the lower right. One is standing on the, let me see. Okay, one is standing on the ground, smoking cigarette, while two others are bending down, seemingly protecting themselves in what could look like a grassy area. Their faces are revealed to the viewer, but because of the dark tone of the colors used, their facial expressions are rather unclear. One of the two soldiers bending down seemed to be closing his eyes, perhaps praying for his safety, while the smoking soldier gazes down, looking disengaged. A figure in the lower left, standing near two potable rice cookers, seemed to be pouring water from a bigger bottle into a smaller one, preparing for the battle. A bayonet attached to his rifle sharply thrust upward, perhaps a subtle but clear expression of Japan's violence. The standing figure in the far right looked in the direction of the battle, leading the viewer's eye toward the middle ground, where several soldiers depicted in a smaller size charges toward the architectural complex in the background, which is the great city walls of Nankin or Nanjing built during the Ming Dynasty. Behind the gates are a town represented only by gable roofs, devoid of human actors populating the buildings. Looming large near the horizon are smokes traveling up in the sky. The painting was photographically reproduced in color in an exhibition catalog later on. To explain the intended message of the painting, the catalog includes a paragraph in text that explains that the enemy put up great resistance, desperately trying to protect the city by setting fire, but the Japanese troops had already surrounded the city. It has been pointed out that the painting was likely inspired by the massacre at Chios by Delacroix, which as I explained earlier, Koiso had seen in Paris. Both paintings invite a viewer's attention to a group of human figures in the foreground, while also presenting another group of people contrasted to them in the middle ground, an upper half of the painting reserved for the vast, expansive sky. It is rather ironic that Koiso would have modeled his painting of Nanjing on a painting about a massacre, since his painting visually does not hint at the horrifying event of the Nanjing massacre, in which Chinese civilians were shot, martyred, raped, and burned. Moving on now to Miyamoto Saburō's war painting. He also produced works about the Second Sino-Japanese War as an official war painter. He visited Beijing in 1940 and stayed there for 3 months, based on which he painted Attack on Nanyang, Beijing. In this painting, which was displayed in the Second Holy War Art Exhibition in 1941, the artist depicts the battle between Japan and China in Beijing, which took place in 1937. It shows a group of Japanese soldiers who are fighting Chinese forces that are invisible but assumed to exist beyond the picture frame to the right. The standing soldier in the center is trying to move toward the enemy with a furious face, raising his right hand with a bayonet attached to it. White, swirling smokes behind him make it look as if he's possessed by supernatural energies. As art historian Carrie Shepherdson Scott observes, there is a striking absence of Chinese soldiers in Japan's war imageries. The removal of Chinese bodies from the visual space enabled the avoidance of the contentious issue of civilian casualties during this military campaign. The stylistic shift from earlier work is remarkable. Red background from 1938 was an intimate portrait of women, but Attack on Nanyang shows multiple male figures in action. The visual space of Attack on Nanyang presents more depth with a distinguishable foreground, middle ground, and background, and the artist's rendering of the objects is much more detailed and naturalistic. The similarity between Miyamoto's attack on Nanyan and Delacroix's liberty leading the people is quite obvious. In Delacroix's allegorical painting, a goddess-like figure with a soft, curvy body with exposed breasts symbolizes civil liberty. With a French flag and a bayonet in her hand, she leads the people behind her and the historical revolution. Like Delacroix, Miyamoto uses a triangular composition, placing the focus on the leading and standing figure in the center and making the scene dynamic. The French flag in Delacroix's work, however, is replaced in Miyamoto's by a Japanese flag, and a semi-nude female figure by a Japanese male soldier. It is important to remember that while Japanese paintings highlight glorious Japanese activities in China to create stability and peace, quote unquote, in East Asia, that was not how people in China experienced the war. Japan's military ground invasion and bombing resulted with mass casualties, humanitarian crisis, and large-scale displacement of people. It is estimated that more than 9 million Chinese people lost their lives during the Second World War, more than 7 million of them civilians. Fen Zikai's A Mother's Head Severed, a woodcut from 1938, is a disturbing image that shows a consequence of Japan's aerial bombing of Chinese cities. A bomb that strikes the head of a breastfeeding mother. An ink drawing titled Chinese Vendor and produced by Chinese painter Jian Zhouhe is a monochrome portrait of an elderly man seated, clutching closely a wooden basket, potentially his only possession. His firm gaze reflects his determination not to let despair take over. It is a powerful image of an old man whose strong will prevails despite adversity. And that's how it was reproduced in the magazine called Asia for North American audiences in 1939. Now I would like to move on to talk about the last painting by Ihara. This painting is not from Japan's war with China, but with the Western Allied nations, especially with the British, who occupied Hong Kong prior to Japan's occupation. Ihara's painting, Hong Kong Surrender, the meeting of Governor Young and General Sakai from 1944, shows the British surrender to Japan 3 years earlier in 1941. Ihara did not actually witness the event, but he traveled to the site 2 years later in 1943 and made sketches of Young and the room where the meeting took place. The painting portrays 14 Japanese officials, most of them sitting in a circle around the table on the left side of the painting. The official with glasses on the left, the only person who rather conspicuously looks straight at the viewer, is General Sakai, who led the meeting. They surround Governor Yan and another British officer standing with a white flag toward the right. The Japanese interrogates Yang with a penetrating stare. Yang looks frightened and has his hand over the face in distress. As I discussed earlier, Ihara was previously greatly interested in Picasso's new classical works, where he also developed his passion for group portrait. One could easily imagine how this wartime painting would have given him an opportunity to further explore the genre. The painting is believed to have been modeled on a photograph of the meeting, which shows both Sakai and Yang, but with a reverse composition. Sakai on the right and Yang on the left. Ihara transformed the documentary photograph of the meeting into a dramatic painting about historic encounter between the two forces, making the room dark and creating shadows, producing a moment to be remembered as part of Japan's glorious history. I would also suggest that there is a possibility that Ihara's painting was modeled after Nazi painting. In the Beginning Was the World by Hermann Otto Heuer in 1937. Although there is no evidence that Ihara knew this particular painting, it is not impossible given that many Nazi works were reproduced in Japanese art magazines. The subject matter and the composition of the paintings are remarkably similar. The crowd on the left, an important individual on the right, next to a standing man with a flag. Heuer's painting depicts a relatively small group of Hitler's followers carefully listening to him, standing on a raised platform and speaking in an exaggerated gesture. Behind him is a man standing straight beside the flag of National Socialism. Both Ihara and Heuer's paintings render small indoor meetings into a historically significant moment. In Ihara's painting, we see a white flag of surrender, not Nazi flag. Okay, now I would like to move on to talk about what happened to those paintings and the artists after the war. I'd like to conclude by discussing what happened after the war. Many of the war propaganda paintings were lost or destroyed, but 153 of them were assembled immediately after the war. This effort was led by Fujita Tsuguharu, who knew some officers in the American occupational government. Initially, they assembled the collection with the naive assumption that the Americans want to exhibit the images at museums. However, when Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Nations, came to learn about the existence of the collection, the occupational government found it problematic and considered the paintings as ideologically dangerous. The American officials did not make any decision until 1950, 5 years after the end of the war, and when they did make the decision, they decided to confiscate the collection. Out of 153 paintings confiscated by the United States, 15 works were by Fujita Tsuguharu, the largest number of the painting in the collection by a single artist. And 7 of them were by Miyamoto, including Attack on Nanyan, which I discussed. 5 of them were by Koiso Ryōhei, and 4 paintings were by Ihara, including a Hong Kong meeting of Governor Yan and General Sakai. The problematic collection of 153 paintings was long forgotten by the Japanese public until 1967, when a photographer, Nakagawa Ichiro, discovered it in a military base in Ohio, the United States. The collection was then returned to Japan, to the National Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo, on indefinite loan from the US government in 1970. The museum displays a few paintings from the collection in its permanent exhibition today. Immediately after the war, there were discussions about war responsibility to interrogate those who collaborated with the state. The discussion also happened in the art world in October 1945, 2 months after the war. Artist Miyata Shigeo published a newspaper article denouncing Fujita Tsuguharu and others who worked for the government during the war and helped the Americans to assemble the collection of war paintings. Miyata called them shameful prostitutes. In response, Fujita argued that the artists were always pacifists in nature and could not have been militarists, and he left Japan permanently for France in 1951, ultimately becoming a French citizen. Fujita's departure seems to have concluded the discussion about war responsibility in the art world. Fujita was an easy scapegoat. No other Japanese artist achieved the same level of success in Paris, and he was seen as a foreigner or non-Japanese, always being the target of jealousy and criticism even before the war. The same level of criticism was never directed toward Ihara Usaburō, Koiso Ryōhei, and Miyamoto Saburō, who also produced numerous war propaganda paintings. 3 months after the end of the war, Ihara commented, quote, "I would like to forget about war paintings as quickly as possible and reset the game," end quote. Ihara became the president of Japan Artists Association and played a significant role in reconstructing post-war Japanese art organizations. He returned to Paris between 1956 and 57 and received the Order of Arts and Letters from the French government in 1960. Miyamoto Saburō likewise spoke publicly about the war paintings in the late 1960s. He continued to describe the painting as, quote, "masterpieces and valuable ethnic and racial monuments," end quote, as he did during the war. Miyamoto further claimed that the wartime paintings were the Japanese counterpart of the art of the Napoleonic Wars, and stated, quote, "We want to avoid miserable wars, but I think fighting for one's own nation is still an honorable task," end quote. In contrast, Koiso Ryōhei never spoke about his war paintings after the war, and for that it was speculated that he regretted having worked for the military. In 2007, Koiso Ryōhei Museum indeed found a letter confirming this point. In the letter he wrote in 1944, Koiso questioned the blind loyalty of painters who produced propaganda works. These three painters never recovered their wartime status or prominence in the art world after the war. Koiso Ryōhei Museum was established in 1992 in Kobe, and Miyamoto Saburō Museum have been established in both Ishikawa Prefecture in Tokyo. They do remain as important artists in the history of Japanese modern art, but their careers reached their peaks in the 1930s and 40s. In the 1950s and 60s, the pre-war avant-garde legacy was revived, and younger generations of artists rebelled against the older generation, those who worked for the state, with more radical works that use abstraction, multimedia, and their own human bodies. Those artists in such groups as Gutai and Bokujinkai established or re-established dialogues with artists in the Western democratic countries, especially the United States and France, that Japan just had been at war with or against. While Japan-France relations do not often appear as a prominent theme in the narrative of the Second World War, as we have seen, Japanese artists' experience in Paris before the war significantly informed their propaganda production during the war. In this presentation, I talked about art and the Second World War, but I can't help but notice, and I hope you did too, the parallel between what I just discussed and what is happening in the world today. The military occupation, settler colonialism, displacement of people, and humanitarian crisis. Living in the West, we're heavily involved in some of the ongoing military conflicts. Like other countries, Japan has recently announced increased budget on national defense in light of escalating global political tension. These developments are deeply, deeply concerning to me, as I have been working on art and war, not because I love wars, but it's quite the opposite. Thank you very much.